This week's Parsha is Parshas Mishpatim. Last week we had Yisroel, we had Matan Torah, we had the giving of the Torah, that's Seres Adibros. This week we have Mishpatim. You'll be able to keep an eye out if I forget and do it again next week. Anyway, so Mishpatim, it starts off, Elah HaMishpatim, these are the, I don't know exactly what the technically precise translation is. It's a bit of a legal thing, and we're going to get to that. Mishpatim, probably the word, I don't know if it's statutes or not. Anyways, doesn't matter. We'll get to it. So these are the laws. Let's call them Mishpatim asher tosim lifneihem, that you shall place before them. Now, there are a number of explanations as to why when it says asher tosim lifneihem, that you shall place before them, it's a bit of an interesting choice of ways to express this, because lifneihem, it could have just said that you shall teach them, that you shall tell over. What does it mean that you shall place before them? And the word lifneim is an interesting word because it can be understood a number of different ways. We're going to look at this and see. So one of the ways that this phrase is understood in the explanation of the word lifneihem, or this sentence, Elah HaMishpatim asher tosim lifneihem, these are the laws that you shall place before them. So Rashi quotes from the Gemara that says, you shall place before them. Literally, obviously, what it means is to teach to the Jewish people. These are the laws that you shall teach to them. But why does it say you shall place before them? One of the additional things that we learn out of this pasuk, out of this verse, is that these rules, these laws shall be judged, shall be adjudicated before them, before Jewish judges specifically. So any time that two Jews have a misunderstanding, something that needs to be addressed legally, you take it to the Jewish justice system, not to a secular justice system. And these laws, Torah laws, need to be judged, adjudicated, worked out, lifneihem, before them, before Jewish judges. So that's one explanation. A second one, also that comes from Gemara, it says, Elah HaMishpatim asher tosim lifneihem. What does it mean, you shall place before them? Lifneihem, before them, the word Pneihem literally means their faces. Lifneihem literally means to their faces, i.e. in front of them. You're going to place it to their face, you're going to place it in front of their face, or place it in front of them. But it also means, or another thing we learn from here, that the Gemara learns from here, from the fact that the Torah chose to use these words lifneihem, as opposed to just saying teach them, tell them, it said place to their faces, literally. So the Gemara learns, and it also comes from the word ponim, pnimius, internally, inside, the internal element. So the Gemara says that when you teach someone these halachas, you have to teach it in a way, laharos loy ponim, to show him the inside, show the reason. You don't just tell someone, Torah says da-da-da, and that's what you do, and that's why you have to do it, and that's it. End of story. You teach the halachas as much as possible, you teach Torah as much as possible, in a way that the person to whom you're teaching it can understand how, why, what's the reason, what's the meaning, what's the purpose. So that's why it says, lifneihem, you shall teach them, lahoros loy ponim, to show them, ponim, the reason, the meaning, the purpose. And there's another explanation that comes from here, another reason for this choice of words that comes from the Talmud Yerushalmi, from the Jerusalem Talmud, that says that here it's picking on the word tosim. Tosim is related to the word sima, which means a mystery, something that's unknown. And it says that you shall teach, and it's talking about teaching Torah relating to the part of Torah that's mysterious, that's unknown. The part of Torah that's, you could call it mystical, part of Torah that's deeper. It's not just the surface level literal understanding of what it means, but also that which is deeper. And related to that, the Alter Rebbe actually teaches that when it says similar teaching coming from a different, or referring to a different element, it's also talking about relating to that which is deeper, not just on the surface level, but not on the part of Torah, on the part of the person. So he says, asher tosim lifneihem, to their pnimius, to that which is inside of them. Now, obviously, that which is inside has many layers. There's a person, there's the hands and the feet and the face and that part of us that we see, and then there's our personality. There are our emotions, maybe a little deeper is our mind, our intellect, the way we think, etc. There's what things we want. You go deeper and deeper. Eventually you get to a place where it's not a function or accessory of the person. It's not a tool that the person has. It's not a thing that the person does. It's the actual person themselves. Every single one of us has the me. Who am I? What am I? Not how do I think? How do I feel? How do I look? How do I act? Me. The me doesn't refer to things that we do, doesn't refer to the way that we operate it. It refers to the essence, to something that's really untouchable. No one is ever going to be able to touch or to interact with or experience the you. That's the deepest pnimius. That's who we are. So the Alter Rebbe says, Eila hamishpatim asher tosim lifneim, when you teach these mitzvahs to a person, you have to teach it in a way that it reaches and connects with their pnimius, not just behaviorally, not just that they connect with it in terms of doing what they have to do and knowing what they have to do, but actually connecting with it on the level of their deepest self, who they are. Now, there are a number of things that we really need to clarify about this, things that seem a little bit counterintuitive. And that's first going back to what I was saying before, picking on the word mishpatim. So I just loosely translated it as laws, mitzvahs, but mishpatim is a technically specific word. There are three kinds of mitzvahs. We have 613, mitzvahs, that are generally divided up into three categories. Mishpatim are mitzvahs that make sense. Don't kill, don't steal, etc. They are mitzvahs that we should have figured them out on our own, even had we not been told in the Torah to do them or to not do them. These are mishpatim. This is a category of mitzvahs that it's expected that any decent human being should understand them on their own. And it's interesting, there's actually an expression that says, L'olam, I'll just say it in English, a person shouldn't say, oh, I would never have wanted to do that Aveira anyway. I would never have wanted to do that sin anyways. A person should be honest and self-aware and acknowledge and say, yeah, like I really would have liked to do that, but I can't because Hashem doesn't let. Now, what that's teaching us primarily is that we don't need to be a good person. I don't need to say that, oh, whatever Hashem says I would have known and that's really how I feel anyway, because it's not necessarily true. But at the same time, that comes with a clarification and with a couple of points in fine print. Number one is, and this isn't the one that I wanted to address, this is just being this is for practical purposes. This is not recommended, and it says explicitly that this is not recommended for someone to say about something that they have a specific challenge with. If there's something that I know that I really battle with, and it's really difficult for me, and this is a real challenge, it's not a good recommendation for me to sit there and go, yeah, I really want to do that so badly, but Hashem doesn't let. Bad idea. I'm just making things more difficult myself. Try to convince myself I don't want to do it, avoid it altogether, whatever. Don't talk about how much I want to do something if I really want to do it. Another point in the fine print, and this is the reason I brought up the whole issue in the first place, is that this is not recommended for something that is objectively bad. A person's not supposed to say, oh yeah, I'd really like to do ... something vile, violent, aggressive, objectively bad, but I can't because Hashem said I can't. That's called being unwell. Right? It's not a mitzvah to say, I really, really want to fill in the blank, or don't. This is talking about, yeah, you know what? Frankly, it'd be pretty convenient if, like, I could order Amazon from my phone on Shabbos. I can't. You know what? Like, I really miss chametz on Pesach. Like, you know, the Seder's nice, but I'd really like to have, like, a good chametz stick dessert at the end. Certainly by the 5th, 6th, 7th day. Like, honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't make me a bad person that I want to eat chametz on Pesach. Doesn't make me a bad person that I wish I had the convenience of being able to do some things on Shabbos. So it's okay for me to acknowledge and say, you know what, I really wish I could. But at the same time, I've dedicated my life to Hashem, to living my life aligned with its purpose as outlined by the Creator in Torah, and therefore I won't. That's perfectly healthy and normal, self-aware, well-adjusted perspective on things. But, as I said, when there are things that are bad, that are objectively negative, there's no mitzvah to say, yeah, I really, really want to do that, but I can't because Hashem said. Right? These are mishpatim. Mishpatim are things that a healthy person doesn't say, I really, really want to do this, I really, really want to do that. Right? A healthy person knows that. Now, it doesn't mean that a healthy person can't ever have temptation to do something that they know they really shouldn't. And that is objectively bad. The fact that it crosses someone's mind that, you know what, if I would just, enter the gray zone and do some things that aren't quite black and aren't quite white, it would really make things a lot easier for me. But I'm not going to because I know I shouldn't. That doesn't make them a bad person, necessarily, but at the same time, we should know that that's the wrong thing to do. Right? Mishpatim are things that every healthy person knows it's the wrong thing to do. That's what Mishpatim is. Now, to move back towards the questions with this pasuk. Oh, sorry. First, let's contrast Mishpatim with Eidos and Chukim, the other two categories. So Eidos, the second category of mitzvahs, the word eidos comes from the word aid, which means witness. Eidos means testimony. This category of mitzvahs are generally things like Pesach and like Shabbos, things that are a testimony to something. These are mitzvahs that a person, you don't have to say that any healthy person would have figured out on their own that we should keep Shabbos, that we should not do malacha, we shouldn't do all the things we're not allowed to do on Shabbos, and that we should make kiddush and light candles. You could be perfectly healthy without coming up with that on your own. You can be perfectly healthy without coming up with Pesach on your own. It's not like it's something that we should have thought of on our own. At the same time, it's something that once we're told, it makes sense. These are testimonies to things. It makes sense. Yeah, I get it. It's not rocket science. Like, I wouldn't have thought of it, but yeah, I get it. Then there's chukim. Chukim are mitzvahs that make no sense. One of the big categories of things that fall under this category of mitzvahs, things that are associated with tumah and tahara, purity and impurity. Now, when we say purity and impurity, halachically, it's very different to what purity and impurity mean in, for example, a laboratory setting. Right? You say something's impure, there are impurities that were introduced into it. It means there's something that doesn't belong there. It's bad. It's unclean generally. Purity and impurity, tumah and tahara, halachically, do not refer to they are not physical phenomena. Right? People say, oh, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. No one ever said that it does make sense. Tumah and tahara, halachic purity and impurity are not physical phenomena. They are spiritual phenomena. Because this is the way that spirituality works as defined by Torah. Does it make sense? No. Does it make sense that if someone is impure and wants to go into the Beis Hamikdash and they're impure because they came into contact with a dead body, they should take water that has the ashes of the Parah Aduma mixed into it and sprinkle it on them a couple of times? No. Explain it to me. Still doesn't make any sense. Because it's not supposed to make sense. These are chukim. So now, let's go back and take a look at some of the things that we have learnt that this pasuk is teaching us. Number one, we said, Devaela hamishpatim, these are the things that asher tosim lifneim, you shall place before them, means that you shall take these specifically to Jewish judges, to a Jewish court, to a Beis Din, not to a secular court. So, as far as this message that the pasuk is teaching us, it makes a lot of sense that it chose mishpatim specifically as opposed to chukim or eidos. It's not going to occur to you to go to the Brooklyn Supreme Court to get a ruling about halachic purity and impurity. No one in their right mind is going to think to do that. Right? No one's going to think that they should go to the Supreme Court of the United States to get a halachic ruling about the laws of Shabbos or Chanukah or Pesach. However, when it comes to a financial disagreement, a disagreement between two people in business, it would make sense to go to a secular court. When it comes to halachas, to mishpatim, to mitzvahs, that any healthy person should figure them out on their own, it makes a lot of sense, logically, to go to a secular court. You go to a Jewish court, you go to a secular court. It's two different ways to approach it. That's why the pasuk specifically tells us about mishpatim. Eila ha-mishpatim, when it comes to mishpatim, even the mitzvahs that do make sense and you understand exactly why they are the way they are and you would have thought of them on their own, you still have to know that as Jews, when you have an issue that relates to mishpatim, you still go to a Jewish court, you still go to a beis din. That is the halacha. Makes perfect sense why, as far as this message that the pasuk is teaching us, it chooses specifically to use the word mishpatim. However, what's the second meaning we said? L'horis leiponim. To teach a person so that they understand. It makes sense. They walk away with some sort of level of comfort, understanding the what and the how and the why, not just, or the how and the why, not just the what. And the pasuk's telling us, lifneihem, teach it to them, l'horis leiponim, so that you teach them a little bit of the inner meaning and working of the mitzvahs, the why and the value of it, the purpose. You probably would have made more sense to emphasize that about the other categories of mitzvahs rather than mishpatim. Right? If I'm sitting in a class and a teacher says, we're learning today mitzvahs in the Torah. Don't kill. Don't steal. Am I going to walk out of class and go, gee, that's really confusing. I wish the teacher would have spent a bit more time explaining why I shouldn't kill and why I shouldn't steal. Hopefully not. Right? But when it comes to Eidos, when it comes to Shabbos, it comes to Chanukah, it comes to Pesach, etc., etc., it would make sense to say, I really don't get why. I really don't get the connection. I really don't get the meaning. I really don't get the purpose. I don't get the basis. I wish the teacher would have spent a little more time just explaining why, what's the connection, what's the meaning, what's the reason. So when it comes to this message of the pasuk, we've got to stop and wonder, why is it telling us this specifically about mishpatim? It should have told us this about Eidos, about Chukim. Now, you can't explain the why of Chukim because there is no why. But you could at least go into some sort of discussion about the why of Chukim as a whole. Why do we need to keep Chukim? Why are Chukim in place, etc., etc.? What's the purpose and the meaning of this category of mitzvahs? Certainly when it comes to Eidos, to these things that we wouldn't have thought of on our own, where there is a reason and there is an explanation to be offered, you would think that here the pasuk would need to emphasize, make sure to teach the students so that they get the inner workings of the mitzvah, not just the technicalities. So why in this message is it emphasizing specifically mishpatim? Can we have the same question when it comes to this explanation that the Rebbe gives, that when you teach it, you shall teach it lipnimiyusam, in a way that it connects also with them, their deepest self, not just their minds, not just their feelings, but the deepest self, the actual soul, the neshama, the essence of who we are. Again, you would have thought that when it comes to chukim, if you want to convince someone that they should keep the laws of Tumah and Tahara, for example, purity, halachic purity and impurity, if you want to convince a guy that he should go to mikveh every day before he goes to daven, you're going to want to convince him that there's something deeper going on, right? If I want to convince you about the rules of something that make no sense, I've got to really tap into your deepest self and get in there as much as possible so that you connect with it on that level where your connection with the Torah and with Hashem and the mitzvahs is operating on a much deeper level. It's not just because it makes sense. It's not just because you relate to it. It's not just because it resonates. It's because you have that connection on such a deep level that nothing else matters. When it comes to chukim, you really want to try to tap into that. When it comes to Eidos, you probably also want to try to tap into that to some extent. Right? It's going to take more to convince someone who's not interested and doesn't care to keep Shabbos than to not kill and not steal. So why, when it comes to Mishpatim, does the Torah feel the need to tell us you have to get these to connect to the person on the deepest, to connect to it, to get these mitzvahs, when you teach them that it should connect to their deepest self, that they should connect to it with their deepest self? Why is this said about this category of mitzvahs that any healthy person can figure out on their own? It should have been emphasized, seemingly, about the other categories of mitzvahs. Certainly the ones that we're not capable of understanding at all, and even perhaps the ones that we can understand, although we wouldn't have thought of them on our own. And to clarify these questions, we have to dig a little into the true identity of mitzvahs and why we're keeping them in the first place, and what mitzvahs are about, and why mitzvahs were given, why Torah was given in the first place. Why were these mitzvahs, why were Mishpatim included as part of the Torah? Right, so let's go back. We discussed at length last week. What happened at Mount Sinai? What happened when Hashem gave us the Torah?
The physical became part of the spiritual, and the spiritual became part of the physical.
Exactly. Right. The information in Torah we already had. The observance of Torah we already had. This was an event that allowed matter and spirit to interact. And that allowed purpose to be more than just the driving force behind what we do. Because the purpose is divine, it allowed that divine purpose behind what we do to actually not just drive our actions, but to actually become a part of what we do. And this is what we're here for. We are here to bring divinity into the material world, to uplift the material world. Right? This is what Torah is all about. This is why Torah was given. If it was just about the technicalities of doing, that was already there before. The Torah was given for us to bring matter and spirit together, to bring divinity into ourselves, into our bodies, to a greater extent into our souls, more than it already was, into our environments, into the world at large. This is true of all mitzvahs. Now, why, when I don't kill, what's divine about that? That's just part of being a healthy human being. Now, going back, and this is part of the discussion of what we were supposed to get into last week, but we didn't have time and we missed out on it. We had to cut short a whole part of the material we were supposed to cover. If you look at the Aseres HaDibros, at the Ten Commandments that were given at Sinai, we read them last week in the Torah. There are what are called there are the first five, which are Bein Adam Lamakim, and then the second five, which are Bein Adam Lachaber. Bein Adam Lamakim means between man and God, believing God, etc., etc. Then the second category of five, which is don't kill, don't steal, etc. The first ones are our individual relationship with the Creator. The second category is the ones that are interactive between people, interpersonal. Now, there may be a question that stares you in the face, which is one of the first five is to honor your parents, which is interpersonal. That's a very valid question, and the answer is a lot more than we have time to get into today, but it is addressed, it is explained, and there is good reason for it. I hope we get to talk about it sometime, because it's actually really amazing. But anyways, so we have here on one hand the Ten Commandments. The first commandment, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. I took you out of Egypt. This is the foundation of religious practice of Judaism, is number one, believing in God. Now, just a side note, when we say believing in God, the mitzvah is not to believe that God exists. Because that mitzvah is really a catch-22. It makes no sense. If I believe that God exists, then God's telling me, believe that thou shalt believe that I exist. I already do. If I don't believe that God exists, God's telling me that I should believe he exists, but I don't believe he exists, so I'm not listening, because as far as I'm concerned, there's a non-existent entity that's telling me to believe that it exists, but I know that it doesn't, so what do I care? Right, so who's this mitzvah talking to? Believe that God exists. Either you do, and it's irrelevant, or you don't, and it's a waste of time. The mitzvah is not to believe that God exists. The mitzvah is to have a relevant, practical, personal belief that affects our human experience. The mitzvah is not to just have an academic belief or awareness of the fact that God exists, but to have an actual personal, human, intellectual, and emotional relationship with the Creator. Every relationship we have with another person has an academic or intellectual part of it, the way that we interact with each other, discuss things, the way we understand each other. And then there's the way we feel about each other. Those two elements exist in every single interpersonal relationship between two human beings. And if we want to have an actual relationship with God, not just like God said, and I'm going to go about my life and do because God said so, that's not really a fantastic relationship. A real relationship with God means that God actually means something to us. God's actually real and relevant and is a part of our life. And when we go about our day, we actually think about it. And it affects the way we behave. It affects our experience. It affects our perception. This is the mitzvah of believing in God. The mitzvah of believing in God is to have a real, effective, relevant belief that's actually a part of our life. And we see this in a number of different places. There are halacha sforim of halacha that talk about the fact that the practical details of this mitzvah are to take, not to convince yourself or to empower yourself with the knowledge that God exists, but to take your awareness, your knowledge, that information about God, and to make it internal, to make it real, to make it a part of who you are. That's the mitzvah. This is the most, I don't even know how to describe it, but the most foundational, probably the least tangible, the most foundational mitzvah we have, the deepest mitzvah we have. This is about our actual, not about our observance of God's directives. It's not even about our commitment to God. It's about our relationship with God. This is the mitzvah, to have a relationship, a real relationship as a human being with the Creator. The same way that a human being, with social animals, human beings need relationships with people. This is telling us that relationship you have with people, you should, can, and are obligated to have with God as well. A real, personal, human, experiential relationship. That's the mitzvah of belief in God. This is the deepest mitzvah that we have. And then a few lines later in the Aseret Dibros, you're telling me not to kidnap, not to kill. It's like almost a bit of a culture shock. Here you are telling me about having a real experiential relationship with divinity, and here I'm getting all involved in that, and then you tell me not to kill. It's like, whoa, where did that come from? How are these two things both happening in the same discussion? And the reason is because the connection, the fact that both of these categories of mitzvahs belong in Aseret Dibros, in the Ten Commandments, comes back to the purpose of the giving of the Torah in the first place. The Torah was given to make everything one. Right, going back, incidentally, now that I already got sidetracked about belief in God and the mitzvah to believe in God, the mitzvah following the mitzvah to believe in God is the mitzvah of Achdus Hashem, of unity of Hashem. Now, unity of Hashem doesn't just mean there's one God and I reject Zeus. That's not what the mitzvah of Achdus Hashem means. Achdus Hashem means the oneness, the unity in everything, the divine unity that really pervades everything that exists. Yes, there are many things that exist in the world. There are things that are hypothetically countable, finite, but practically speaking, absolutely uncountable. The number of entities that exist in the world, and you don't even have to go down to the level of atoms for it to be uncountable, practically. But at the same time, it's all really one. It has the same divinity behind it that makes it all exist. It has the same divine purpose. Achdus is seeing that oneness of the Creator. And because everything comes from and exists in the Creator, that oneness really pervades everything that exists. So it's this oneness, unity, but really I think oneness is probably a better word than unity. Because unity makes it sound like a bunch of people, and instead of arguing, we're all together and we get along. This isn't just talking about unity, it's oneness, everything being one, not just coming together, but actually being one. It's oneness of matter and spirit. When our awareness, our perspective is on point, we're going to see that the physical and the spiritual, as much as they technically are unable to interact, the reason they were created with the barriers that prevent them from being able to interact naturally is because they're both serving the same purpose. They're both here to contribute towards the same purpose. So the difference between them is a part of the oneness. They are both here to serve different functions in this one purpose of the divine global purpose of all existence, which is the novelty of the union of matter and spirit through our actions, bringing divinity, bringing God into the world. So this oneness is expressed in unifying matter and spirit. It doesn't mean that they cease to be two different entities, but the true oneness is seeing how, despite the fact that they're different entities, they are still one. Because the oneness is not denying the fact that they're separate entities. That would mean that there's some sort of delusion here. Either we're delusional about the fact that they appear different but they're not, or we're delusional about the oneness. But it's not, because they can be one even as different as they are. This is true of matter and spirit. It's true of people as different as we are. It's true of the mitzvah to make belief in God real, personal, experiential, and the mitzvah to not kill. It's the same thing. Everything boils down to oneness at the end of the day, at its deepest level. The reason we don't kill is the same as the reason we put in effort, invest effort in developing an experiential relationship with God. Now, here it's a little bit delicate, because that's not saying that a person, as we said, it's not saying a person should say, I really want to kill, but I can't because God doesn't let. That's not a very highly recommended perspective. At the same time, when we observe these mitzvahs, when I deal honestly in business, if I am aware of the fact that I am dealing honestly in business because God has instructed me to do it, not only because it's morally correct and because I appreciate the fact that it's necessary, but because this is what God has directed me to do, I am now expressing that oneness, the seamlessness between everything as different as everything, all the different parts of the universe seem to be, and actually are, they are also one. And when I show that the purpose behind everything I do is the same, they become one. When I am honest in business because this is what the Creator has told me to do, it doesn't mean that had the Creator not told me to do it, I would be dishonest, but it means that when I am honest, I'm aware of the fact that I need to be honest because the Creator has instructed me to, and that is my foremost motivation for doing it. Even more than the fact that it's just moral and good and I would have done it anyways, but my foremost reason for doing it is that this is what the Creator of the universe has instructed me to do. When this is the foremost reason for everything I do, it changes things entirely. Because if I keep the moral mitzvahs, the obvious mitzvahs, because they're moral, because they're obvious, then that's really all they are, at least in my experience. I am being honest because it's the right thing to do. Nothing to do with God, nothing to do with Torah, nothing to do with religion. Just, it's the right thing to do. That's healthy, and we should be people who would operate like that had we not been given the Torah. But as moral and upstanding as that is, and it is admirable and it is objectively good, it's still not divinity. when I am honest in business and I treat people with respect and I am sensitive to the people around me and etc., 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 all these things, and I just, let's summarize it all as basically being a mensch, just behaving like a decent human being, when my foremost motivation for doing that, even more than the fact that it's the way that I should be morally, is because of the fact that this is the way that the Creator has told me to behave. Now, instead of being things that are just moral, but still mundane rather than divine, they have now become divine. Now my honesty has become an act of fulfilling the directives of the Creator, which means that that act is now a divine act, and the things that I did in that process have had divinity, have had God incorporated into them, because that was my motivation for doing them.
So this is effectively changing the objective definition of good and bad to Hashem's, not ours, because we might think it seems obvious not to murder, but then if we're left up to our own devices and our own logic, you can also get things like the Holocaust, where it's okay to murder. So if the objective definition of good or bad is defined by Hashem, then we'll never do those things. But if it's left to us, we could.
100%. And that's actually that's part of the discussion that we are hopefully going to get to. We still have a bit of time left. But here, that's true, and that's part of the discussion. Here, there's something else that's deeper as well. Right? And that's very important, because the moment that morals are subjective, which outside of connecting morals to a divine entity that has an objective say about truth, outside of that, by definition, they are subjective, and the proof of the pudding's in the eating. Different countries have different laws. Right? And the fact that different countries go about some civil matters very differently doesn't mean that one is better, more or less correct than the other. There's leeway, because it's subjective, right? And coming from the perspective of democracy, if you have democratic countries that have decided and ruled by the votes of the people in those countries to do things differently in ways that one country has chosen specifically not to do things and another country has chosen specifically to do things that way, it doesn't mean it's right or wrong or moral or immoral. Now, it's possible that democracy could lead to very immoral things, but that already means by definition that morality is subjective. Because the fact is, we see things differently. Right? Just random example to illustrate. It's going to be somewhat extreme, because extreme examples tend to be effective at illustrating things. It's not super extreme, don't freak out. But, right? And this is something that happened certainly way back. I don't know to what extent it may still happen in some places in the world. Punishment for theft may be cutting off someone's hand. Now, like, whoa, that's pretty extreme. Like, this person has to live the rest of their life without their hand because they stole. And maybe what they stole was a piece of bread. Like, maybe, I'm not necessarily talking about Bernie Madoff over here. I'm sure there are a lot of people that would love to see him lose his hands. Right? So, on one hand, it's like ridiculously extreme, and that's immoral. A person stole, make them pay it back. Give them a fine. Don't chop off their hand. It's in a separate category. Don't cut someone's hand off because they stole something of financial value. You give a financial punishment. But then you could look at things a little bit differently. Imagine that you have a society where people walk around safe and secure. There's no need to lock your doors at night because people don't steal. There's no concept of taking something that doesn't belong to you. This belongs to me, it doesn't belong to you, and you don't touch it. These things belong to you, they don't belong to me, and I don't touch it. Just imagine a hypothetical world in which that's the way people lived. There was no concept of locks on doors. Because there was a universal respect for boundaries, for ownership, and it just worked. And then you have one person who comes along and steals. And completely, in that act of one little thing that they stole, they have completely destroyed the security that this society enjoyed. Because there's no longer a concept of universal, unquestioning respect for boundaries and ownership, and no one's ever going to steal. Boom, it's over. Everyone has to start putting locks on their doors. Everyone has to start looking over their shoulder. This person, in their act of stealing, has literally destroyed the security and completely ruined the life experience all day, every day for every single person in this society. That's a really big deal. Yeah, they could pay back what they stole for, but the fact is they have ruined it. They just blew it for everybody. Right? Looking at it from that perspective, active stealing is a pretty big deal. If nobody stole, everybody's life, our quality of life would just be, we can't even imagine it, because there's no such, practically, there's no such thing, I don't think, as a society in which there is no concept of theft. But just imagine if there was, how different life would be. Which means that every time someone steals, they're actually not just taking someone's property, the ramifications of that are really bad. Right? Two very different ways of looking at the same action. Neither's I don't think that either is any more or less objectively correct. Right? And you could have a very valid discussion between two people, each arguing this side of the argument. They're both good people. They both respect each other. They see things very differently. Neither of them's immoral, necessarily. Each of them may see the other one as being completely wrong and completely off the mark. But if you have a little bit of a broad perspective, you don't see them necessarily as being immoral. Because right and wrong are subjective. And, I'm projecting or presenting a scenario here in which the two people have a broad enough perspective to not see each other as immoral, but they very well may see each other as immoral. And each one can look at them and say, well, the argument that I'm presenting is the definition of morality, and what you're presenting is completely immoral. Either because it's completely inhumane and disproportionate to cut someone's hand off, or because you are effectively allowing the fabric of society to be destroyed because you don't have the backbone to stand up and to enforce things that make society livable. Right? Very, very subjective. And I could give countless examples of this. For example, when it comes to medical ethics is another kind of place where things are very delicate, and you can have people who have completely diametrically opposed opinions, and each one may be convinced that the other one is the epitome of immorality, where neither of them sees themselves as being immoral, neither of them sees themselves as presenting a bad opinion. It's just morality is subjective, right? Which is basically what you're getting at. So unless you have a sense of morality being objectively defined by a divine entity that has the authority to define morality, the whole concept of morality really ceases to exist, because morality is subjective by definition. The whole thing is wishy-washy. Here we're going a step deeper. It's not just that if you don't have this acceptance of and commitment to divinity, even in things of morality, that you risk going off mark. But even if you stay on point, even if your perspective stays true to what Torah says, the bottom line is, if my motivation for doing what I'm doing is human, i.e. it's my sense of morality, my sense of ethics, my sense of responsibility to do things the way that I perceive as being the right way to do it, then that's the extent of what I've achieved. If I'm doing it because the Creator has told me to do it, the primary driving force behind my observance of this mitzvah, behind my doing things the right way, is the fact that the Creator has told me to do it, and it's part of the collective divine purpose of all existence. I have now brought that divinity, that divine purpose, into the action that I did. So when the reason that I observe even Mishpatim, even logical and ethical mitzvahs, is because, first and foremost, because that's what the Creator has instructed me to do, I have now brought divinity into that act. I have now increased the extent to which there is oneness that has been not just behind the scenes, but has now been manifest and brought into the world on a practical level. I did an act for its divine purpose, which means that that divinity in that purpose was brought into the act that I did, into the objects that we used, etc., into the processes. So because the whole purpose of the giving the Torah in the giving of the Torah was to realize oneness, to bring out the oneness in things that are different, not because we show that they're not really different, but because we show that they are different because they have different roles to play in the same purpose. They're on the same team, trying to achieve the same objective together. We bring out the oneness in the differences. That's the mitzvah. That's oneness. That's the true oneness of God. Oh, the oneness of God is a lot deeper than that, but this is an expression of or a manifestation of that oneness. That's why Torah was given, so we could realize the oneness of matter and spirit. As different as they are, we can bring them together through our actions. The oneness of these very divine, spiritual feeling mitzvahs that we have between us and God, like realizing our faith and making it something that's experiential and relevant, not just academic, making that one with not killing and not stealing. It's that oneness. Both of these categories of mitzvahs are included in the Aseret Dibros because this is what Torah is about. Fulfilling all of those mitzvahs for the same underlying purpose. Because this is what the Creator has instructed us to do. And when we do this, when we follow the Creator's directives, we are bringing divinity into the world, into our actions, into every single physical atom and subatomic particle that's involved in the process, into the energy that's involved in the process, into the environment, into the space, into the time. This is why these two categories of mitzvahs are included together. And this is why when the Torah tells us that you shall teach the mitzvahs in a way that the student connects to them, not just with their mind and not just with their emotions, but with their deepest self, with the essence of their soul, with not just how we are, how we think, how we feel, but who we are and what we are. That's supposed to be true of Mishpatim too. Because the reason we fulfill Mishpatim is not supposed to be just because they make sense, just because it's the morally right thing to do. Now again, number one is, as you said, Eliana, that first of all, when we do the Mishpatim, these logical, rational mitzvahs, because of the fact that they're rational, it becomes very, very dangerous. Because morality is subjective. And we've seen, unfortunately, very just mind-blowingly horrific examples of people who did the most depraved things that were unimaginable until they did them, in the name of rational morality. So that's first and foremost a very practical, real grave danger that exists when the reason we fulfill the rational mitzvahs is only because of the fact that they're rational. Because our perception of the rationale could evolve, it could change. And if the reason we did them was because they seemed rational to us, because we accepted them as making sense, then there's the risk that that could change if our perception of that rationale changes. That's number one. But number two, much deeper, is that even if we always do the right thing, the same way that a person has a body and a soul, an act has a body and a soul. The body of a person is, we know what a body is, and the soul is that non-physical, intangible part of the person. To an extent, that's part of it, at least. The body of a mitzvah, the body of any action, is the actual physical act. Putting on tefillin. The body of putting on tefillin is taking the tefillin, tying them around the arm, striking a match, lighting the Shabbos candle. The soul of the mitzvah is the intangible part. It's the purpose. It's the driving force. It's the why we're doing it. That's the soul of the mitzvah. Now, the same way that halachically, first priority, the thing that comes before everything else, is physical health, every single mitzvah pretty much goes on a second tier after looking after our well-being. If someone's life is at risk, everything else goes out of the way. And this is a complete tangent, but it's important. And now that it entered my mind, I want to say it because just in case anyone has never heard it, it's extremely important to know. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, we've seen a number of examples in recent years just in the vicinity of this city of why it's made. I mean, none of those examples, hopefully, this is the reason, but we see the danger. There's a halacha that on Shabbos you're not allowed to put out a fire. You are absolutely not allowed to put out a fire on Shabbos. If a person's going to lose their entire home, all their assets, everything's going to burn down to the ground, sorry, you can't put out a fire on Shabbos. Yeah. But if someone's safety is at risk, you are obligated to put out that fire without a second thought. And this is very important to know because in a place like this, a city that has a high population density, and this is something that I personally explicitly asked a Rav. I asked Rabbi Heller and he said, yes, it's 100% true, and it's something that you should be publicizing and telling as many people as possible about. If you ever see a fire on Shabbos in a place like this, in a place that has a high population density, you don't stop and think about whether or not it's dangerous. You don't stop and think about how far it's going to spread before the fire department gets there. You just put it out. You see a fire on Shabbos in Brooklyn, you put it out. No questions asked. You don't hesitate. You don't stop to think. You just put it out. Because safety, life comes before the mitzvahs. Now, the same way that in terms of a person, the physical safety, the physical health comes before spirituality, because if you don't have a physical body, if a person's not alive, they can't fulfill mitzvahs. A secret to tell you. So the Torah says, look after your body. As long as the safety of your body is ensured, then the number one priority is Torah and mitzvahs. But you do never jeopardize the safety of your body for the mitzvahs. Same thing is true of the mitzvahs themselves. Number one priority is the body of the mitzvah. Number one priority is to light those Shabbos candles, is to put on those tefillin, is to do what the mitzvah says, to give the money, to put the money in the pushka, to give the charity, to buy the food for the hungry person. Priority number two is to have the soul of the mitzvah, the purpose and the meaning, the driving force behind the mitzvah, why I'm doing it. So, yes, priority number one is the body of the mitzvah, but it is doing it, that comes number one. If you have the option of lighting Shabbos candles with no time to think too deeply about it, just do it and move on because you're in a rush, or you can meditate about how valuable it is and not light the Shabbos candles, no question, light the Shabbos candles, move on. Comes first. At the same time, the fact is, right, the fact that we prioritize the safety and health of the body first doesn't mean that the health and safety of the soul is irrelevant or unimportant. And the same is true of the mitzvahs. The health and safety, the health of the soul of the mitzvah is very, very important. Yes, observance of the mitzvah technically, practically comes first, but it still makes an enormous difference. The why? What's the driving force? And that's why when it comes to Mishpatim specifically, we are told, even when it comes to Mishpatim, number one, lahoros leiponim, you explain to the student the why. You explain to the student, when it comes to Eidus and Chukim, we understand why you have to really put time and effort into explaining the why, the internal workings of the mitzvah. With Mishpatim, why do you have to explain it? You still have to explain it to make sure that it's clear that the foremost reason for keeping Mishpatim is because Hashem said so. Should you have the frame of mind that you would have kept them anyway? Absolutely 100%. You should not be saying that I would really have loved to do things that are really bad. I'm not doing them because Hashem said so. Bad idea. But the fact that Hashem told us to do what He told us to do should still be the foremost motivation and reason for doing them. When the foremost motivation for doing a given thing, a given action, is the fact that it is part of the collective divine purpose of existence because the Creator has told us to do it, that divinity now becomes a part of what we did because that was the driving force, that's the soul of the action. This is why it's important to explain the why of mitzvahs for Mishpatim also, not only for Eidus and Chukim. And this is why it's important also to make sure that when you teach mitzvahs to someone, they connect with it at the deepest level of their soul, even for Mishpatim, because Mishpatim are no less mitzvahs than Eidus and Chukim. They are no less an act of following the guidelines of the Creator that He has given us in Torah than keeping Shabbos or the laws of purity and Para Aduma before going into the Beis Hamikdash. If I don't kill, and my foremost motivation, my secondary motivation is because it's wrong and I wouldn't do it anyway, my foremost motivation is because that's what the Creator told me to do, that has now become an act of divinity. And it's important to teach and to make sure that we connect to the mitzvahs on that deepest level of the essence of our soul, not just with our mind and our feelings, even for Mishpatim, because Mishpatim are just as much a part of Torah as Eidos and Chukim are. And we see this, and it's really this theme of oneness really is a very fundamental part of last week's Parsha and this week's Parsha. The Ten Commandments, why the Torah was given on Sinai in the first place, was about the oneness of matter and spirit. Why these two very different categories of mitzvahs that seem just to not belong in the same discussion of having a real personal, experiential, interactive, emotional, human relationship with God and not killing, not kidnapping, don't seem to belong in the same same discussion, but they do. Because the underlying purpose is the same. The deepest underlying purpose is the same. It's that oneness. And when our foremost purpose for everything we do is because that's what we're supposed to do, because that's what the Creator has instructed us to do, then we bring divinity into those things, even though we may have done the right thing otherwise anyway, but then it would have just, the sum total of what we did would have been a human action. It could have been an excellent, moral, upstanding human action, but it still would have been a human action. When the primary driving force is because this is what the Creator has told us to do, it has now become a divine action. Divinity has become incorporated into what we did. And this is why when it says, Eila ha-mishpatim asher tosim lifneim, these are the laws that you shall present to your students in a way that they get the reasoning and the purpose. And these are the things that you shall present to your student in a way that they not only understand it and connect with it emotionally, but connect with it in the deepest layers of their soul, is still relevant for Mishpatim. And this is why the Pasuk specifically emphasizes Mishpatim, because for Eidos and Chukim, if it had said Eidos and Chukim, we may have thought, yeah, that doesn't really apply to Mishpatim. Mishpatim we would have known anyways. You don't really have to worry about that. You don't have to harp on to that. Just tell them the Mishpatim, and then when it comes to Eidos and Chukim, you've really got to drill at home. No. The Pasuk specifically tells us these lessons about Mishpatim to make sure that we know that this is true of Mishpatim too. Divinity and realizing this oneness should be the driving force behind our Mishpatim as well. And that's why the Torah specifically teaches us this lesson about Mishpatim. Because Mishpatim, things that are logical, rational, moral mitzvahs, are equally opportunities to bring divinity into the world. As long as the reason, our foremost motivation for doing them is divinity, is the fact that this is what the Creator has told us to do. If that's our primary motivation, then we are bringing that divinity into the world through these actions. Am I way over time? No, not too bad.